Okay, everyone, welcome to the IEU, the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund, and to our IEU Virtual Talk. Thanks for joining. We got a little bit over 37, 38 people that have joined us so far, and we will have a couple more joining shortly. As you may know, the IEU holds monthly lunch talks, and given the current circumstances, the IEU has created a series of virtual talks to complement our lunch talks. So these virtual talks feature leaders in the international space and are a great venue for dialogue and exchange. We also use this opportunity to increase the understanding about the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund and the Green Climate Fund overall, while also raising awareness of the diversity of voices and the streams of learning in the area of evaluations. And that in particular relates to the climate change space, as well as the development space and evaluation. This talk is recorded, and we will put this IEU virtual lunch talk onto our IEU YouTube channel. So please subscribe to our channel and keep us keep up with the latest videos. I also like to encourage you to tweet by using our IEU handle, the GCF_eval. Our event has also a hashtag. It's the hashtag #IEUTalks. And there's also on your screen right now a QR code. So if you want to join our social media and online channels, just scan this QR code with your mobile phone. I also wanted to alert you to the fact that these talks are open talks, open to everyone. So we encourage you all to share the information about these talks with people outside the GCF and within your professional circles. This virtual talk, as well as every other virtual talk, will take up to 1 hour in a session, and will always be hosted from 5 to 6. Today's talk, and that is in a particular talk, is done in collaboration with the German Institute for Development Evaluation, DEval. So let me come right away to the topic of today. So the topic of today is on the overview of evidence gap map intervention heat maps of the climate change adaptation. So evidence gap maps depict high quality evidence and the lack thereof in a particular thematic area, here in this case in climate change adaptation. So participants will also learn about the opportunities and limitations associated with such evidence gap maps and the relevance of and implications of such maps for decision makers. As I said, this is a joint collaboration between the IEU and DEval. So this talk will focus on our most recently published evidence gap map and intervention heat map in climate change adaptation. Let me present to you the two key presenters that we have here today. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Nathalie Doswald. She has been working with us jointly on this evidence gap map, and she is currently a climate change and biodiversity consultant with AAE. She's also been working over a decade in the international nature conservation and climate change space, providing technical expertise and research to inform policy and decision-making processes. She currently works with UNEP, with UNEP's Disaster and Conflict Program on nature-based solutions. Our second presenter is Luis Sánchez Torrente. He's also a consultant, an associate consultant with AAE. Luis is a social development specialist and evaluator. He specializes in social inclusion of vulnerable groups, climate change adaptation, labor market policies, and social impact assessments of infrastructure projects. So we're very happy to have them here today. Next to this, we also have our key discussants for today. That's on the one hand, Dr. Martin Prowse, who is an evaluation specialist here at the IEU, and he is joined by Alexandra Köngeter, an evaluator from DEval, as well as Kevin Moull, also an evaluator at DEval. For the agenda today, we will be speaking, we will have the presentation on the evidence gap map and intervention heat maps by Nathalie and Louis, followed by a brief talk on key discussion points that Martin, as well as Alexandra and Kevin would like to bring forward. And then we will wrap up this virtual talk with a moderated Q&A session where you can ask all the different questions on the evidence gap map intervention heat map that is presented today, as well as all other discussions that have happened. So I'd like to encourage you once more to mute and use your mute button to not cause too much of a problem for the speakers today, as well as we encourage you to submit your questions through the Zoom chat box during the talk so we can address these questions afterwards. And once again, it would be great if you follow us on social media and tweet about our virtual talks. Studies and research has shown that once you tweet about an event, you will always remember the content of that webinar and that talk. And so we would like to encourage you to do that. So without further delay, I hand it over to Nathalie, our first speaker. Over to you, Nathalie.
Thank you, Andreas, and thank you for the opportunity. So if we could move to the next slide. So as you know, climate change adaptation has now become a necessity. Many countries are experiencing really severe impacts resulting in major disasters. So adaptation has therefore also risen in international development cooperation as a necessity to help countries in their climate change adaptation. At the same time, what one can see is that there has also been a rise in interest in the scientific community on evaluating and studying climate change adaptation projects. So if you can have a quick look at this graph, which is just a search which we did on Web of Science for the results of climate change adaptation, you can see that since around 2007, there was a sharp rise in the peer-reviewed literature on climate change adaptation, which makes sense. It's also being kicked off, mirroring the IPCC process. Next slide, please. So when it comes to thinking about adaptation, and if we are going to help countries or even help ourselves adapt to climate change, we really would like to know which adaptation measures or actions or interventions are going to be effective. This is important for us because, you know, we don't want to be implementing and spending a lot of time and money on things that are not going to help us increase our resilience and reduce climate risk. But in order to know that, you need to have some evidence. And so that is a key question that our study was looking into. What evidence exists to climate change adaptation in terms of the interventions? And also, given that there is very little known in the sense of aggregated studies, we know that there has been a lot of studies out there, but very little synthetic studies. We want to also know what is this evidence looking at? So in order to do that, one of the best tools available is an evidence gap map. So what is an evidence gap map? Next slide, please. An evidence gap map basically categorizes studies on a topic in a framework, and the framework is basically like a table. On the left hand down, you will have a series of adaptation interventions. So given adaptation is a wide spread across sectors, we decided to look at different interventions within different sectors. We categorized 4 sectors: water, built environment and land use, agriculture, forestry and fishing, and the last one, which is a little bit of a catch-all, must admit, society, economy and health. And within those, we had several interventions like nature-based solutions. You can read them on your screen to avoid me reading them all out. So these are the interventions per sector. So therefore, if we have a study looking at a particular intervention, we can classify it under that under this structure. But then what we're also interested in knowing is, what is it studying? What outcomes is it studying? So we created a series of outcomes under which we could classify all these studies. And you can see those at the top of this framework. And these were classified under uptake. So first of all, are interventions being used? Then are they reducing shocks or stresses? Are they increasing adaptive capacity? And are they contributing to the enabling environment? So are they making any difference on environmental systems, on socioeconomic systems, on institutional systems? And we had some subcategories. So basically an EGM, it will go through the literature, and we will then find a study and classify it under these interventions and outcomes. Next slide, please. So the question, you can't just have a general evidence gap map. You need to have a question so that you can find the relevant literature. And the question that we were asking is, what is the state of the evidence base regarding the ability of adaptation interventions to help people in low to middle income countries adapt to the impacts of climate change? So here we're really looking at the development space. We're really looking at adaptation intervention. So this is what we were looking for in the literature. So any intervention that aims to reduce, adjust, or make use of the benefits of an impact of climate change. We were ensuring, when we were looking for evidence, we were looking at to see, does it impact anybody living in low to middle income countries? And we were looking also in papers to see whether there was anything relating to an outcome in terms of human adaptation to climate change. So this was the key question which helped us categorize studies when we were filtering through them. Next slide, please. Now I'll pass on to my colleague Luis to kind of go through some of the details and results of our study.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. Thank you very much, Andres, for the introduction. So in this slide, I would like to take you through the process for constructing this evidence gap map. So just in case you're thinking of conducting your own evidence gap map, so you know what you're getting into. So we started out with 12,744 research papers, plus around 4,000 great literature papers that were first screened, and that means basically reading the abstract and the title and trying to select those that are relevant to us according to our inclusion exclusion criteria. Then we move into the next stage, which is reading the body of the research itself and doing a second filter. And in this process, we ended up with 464 final papers to be mapped into our framework. So as you see, it's a lot of work. It's a tedious work, but it guarantees you to have a comprehensive evidence gap map. Something that is important to understand, will help us to interpret the results, is that with these 464 papers, we identified what we call individual pieces of evidence, because a single paper can test different effects or different interventions within the same study. So we have mapped, the mapping exercise is done in terms of this 1,035 individual pieces of evidence collected in 464 articles or papers. So this is a summary of the process. It's a lengthy process and highly systematized, and this is the final result. So if we move into the next slide, please. So I'll give you a glimpse of the results. I'll start out by the regional distribution of the evidence that we collected. As you can see, the most represented region is Sub-Saharan Africa, followed by South Asia and East Asia and the Pacific. Perhaps you're surprised by a certain misrepresentation of Latin America and the Caribbean. I think this is one of the weaknesses of our study, because we were picking studies that at least the title and the abstract were written in English, and perhaps there is literature out there that it's exclusively written in Spanish and it wasn't captured by our search protocol. Some of the top countries in the list are China, India, Ethiopia in Africa, Bangladesh, Kenya, Pakistan. So you have a list there of the countries that are more represented in our evidence gap map. If we follow, if we move to the next one, please. So this is the evidence gap map itself. So by columns, you have the outcomes that Nathalie mentioned earlier. And by rows, you have first grouped the sectors, the 4 sectors that we identify. And each of them, you have the set of interventions. The interventions are the same for each of the sectors for symmetry purposes. And the colors, intensity of the colors, and the numbers themselves, of course, tell us where the evidence is most concentrated. So there's a lot of information in this evidence gap map, but the first things that we see here, it's some the main gaps and then the main concentration areas according to the colors. It's evident that the forest and agricultural sector has captured most of the evidence, whereas water is probably the less populated in terms of evidence. If we see it vertically, it's also quite evident that the right-hand side of the evidence gap map is less populated, which corresponds to what we call enabling environment, those actions that seek reinforcing the entire system. But I'll go in more detail and conclusions. But this is just for you to have a first overview of what an evidence gap map is and what it looks like. As Nathalie said, nothing is said here about what works or what doesn't work. It just tells us where the evidence is according to those categories that we have defined in terms of sectors, in terms of interventions, and in terms of outcomes. So if we move into the next slide, please. This is an example of the type of specific analysis that we can do once our evidence gap map is constructed. In this graph, you can see the distribution of the evidence by sector and outcome group. And as I said before, in our case, we see a high concentration of the evidence around forestry, fishing, and agriculture, followed by society, economy, and health. Not so much in water, and this might be surprising for some of you, being the water sector so relevant for climate change adaptation. This perhaps has to do with the fact that the type of evidence that we are looking for, which is rigorous, exposed evaluations with quantitative methods, is not so frequent in the water sector, which is driven by infrastructure type of interventions. And in this kind of interventions, we find more like ex-ante type of impact evaluations through modeling projections and things like that. So this might be one of the explanatory factors. If we move into the next one, please. So in this graph, there are many possibilities of analysis. There are many different dimensions and categories that we can use for disaggregating the results. So this is another example. We have here the distribution of by outcomes within each sector, just to portray that different sectors obviously have different focuses, and when it comes to the design of the studies and the purpose of the studies. So, for example, we see that in general the evidence is evenly distributed across different sectors, but across different outcomes, sorry. But for example, decreased impacts and risks is much more frequent in society and economy, whereas in forestry, fishing, and agriculture, the focus is around economic benefits like productivity gains, yield gains, and things like that. Let's move to the next one, please. So this evidence gap map is the first step in the entire research initiative around this topic. It sets the playground for other possible actions that are useful for policy making and decision making. One of the things that we decided to do is a heat map. And a heat map is a very similar exercise. We also map things, but what we map here is the funds and the interventions from a particular institution, in this case, the Green Climate Fund and the German corporation. So the purpose is comparing where the evidence goes with where the funds goes. So we have this two frameworks, these two maps that allows comparisons to see whether the evidence reflects the resources that are applied to climate change intervention, or the other way around. Does the money goes to where the evidence is? Can be interpreted in both ways. So basically, what we did is we analyzed a portfolio of projects both from the German corporation and the Green Climate Fund, and try to map them into the same framework, the same categories, the same interventions, and the same outcomes. So we can perform this comparative analysis. And in the next slide, please, we have a very similar looking slide. At first sight, it's difficult to draw any conclusions, but actually we can see some similar trends, like some concentration around the forestry, fishing, and agricultural sector. Although perhaps one interesting result at first glance is that the right-hand side section of the map is much more populated than in the case of evidence. So we see that there's funds flowing towards the enabling environment, whereas there's not so much evidence. So the same type of analysis can be performed in the intervention heat map by different categories, but the interesting thing here is comparing both. So in the next slide, please, we can have an example of this analysis, comparing evidence against resources or funds. One clarification, in the previous slide, what we see is the number of projects, whereas in this graph, we are comparing evidence and funds. We did both. The intervention heat map is defined in terms of both number of projects on one side and then the overall amount of funds on the other side. So here we compare here funds and evidence according to outcomes, but it can be done also by interventions and sectors. But here, as I mentioned before, it seems that there's surplus compared to evidence of funds in the enabling environment related outcomes. Those are environmental systems, socioeconomic systems, institutional systems. We find that more money flows to this type of outcomes than the actual evidence. Whereas the funds come short compared to evidence in some other outcomes, like in economic benefits. The interpretation of these results, it needs to be nuanced, because one needs to think whether this gaps and differences between resources and evidence corresponds to a shortage of funds, or it can be also an issue of the suitability of research and evidence in those particular areas. But that's food for thought for later discussion. But at least this is a very powerful tool to portray the main trends in both evidence and expenditure in climate change adaptation. So back to you, Nathalie, for some overall conclusions on the evidence gap map and the intervention heat map.
Thank you. Next slide, please. We'll just try and wrap up quickly. So you've been shown a lot of information, and then there's obviously a lot more that we could, delve deep into and discuss. But I'm just going to try and put some of these key observations in a way that we may be able to see differences between the evidence gap map and the evidence heat map. If we look at areas where there is a lot of evidence and also where there's a lot of projects and going towards, you will see that there's a lot of evidence in sub-Saharan Africa, and in terms of projects, there's also a lot of projects in sub-Saharan Africa, but also Latin America. And as Luis touched upon, Latin America, we can't really see that there's no evidence. I think that I really believe this is a limitation of our study. In terms of sector, once again, agriculture seems to be really the key area, and this really makes sense because this is really where in a lot of places in developing countries people really need help and also are most affected by climate change. Crops, if there's questions of related to water availability and security, this needs work. So there's a good match here between the evidence. In terms of the types of interventions that you find have had the most study, and also the types of evidence that we find, types of interventions that also are most used, they match once again. I know we didn't really show this in the previous graphs, but they are related to nature-based options, which is not surprising since we're talking about the agricultural sector, and also informational, educational. And here, what this really translates down to when you read the paper are extension services, which I think are really helpful. In terms of outcomes, there we do find, as Louisa said, there's a difference. There's been a lot studied on adoption, which kind of makes sense because we'd want to know why people will take up new things to help them adapt to climate change. And also there's been a lot studied on the economical benefits. A, because I think that's probably of interest, but B, it's also easier to measure. You can measure yield and you can measure income. So that's also, I would say, a reason that there's a lot of studies looking at that. On the other hand, in the projects being funded, the most goes towards the enabling environment, which makes sense because in the sense of if you really want to make a change in the world, you really want to be targeting the enabling environment. But that hasn't had so much study. And I think this is it is also probably because it's not so easy to study. So this could be something in the future to try and get some good studies going at looking at the enabling environment as an outcome. Next slide, please. In terms of gaps, this is an evidence gap map. In the EGM, well, the region was Latin America. We've already talked about that. In the heat map, Europe, Central Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. Well, this kind of makes sense in terms of development. Sectors, the key gaps in terms of evidence are the water sector or the built environment sector. This is reflected when you look at the actual projects. If you look at projects, there's not that many in the water or built environment sector. However, when you look at the distribution of funds, there is an equal amount of funds distributed among all the types of sectors, more or less. And in a certain sense, if you think about it, big infrastructural projects and big water projects are going to be more expensive. So there, I think that makes some sense. But there is a lack of, let's say, quantitative evidence, which is what we were looking at. But as Louise said, this is probably because these studies don't lend themselves so easily to impact evaluation type studies. In terms of interventions, the gaps really depends on sector. In a sense, the interventions in the EGM do mirror the types of interventions that you would find in each sector. In the evidence in the intervention heat map, there are less projects looking at financial and market mechanisms and built infrastructure and structural interventions, but this does not relate in terms of funding. Once again, these types of interventions cost more, so therefore funds. But I think that's interesting to note. In terms of outcomes, I think this has already been discussed a bit, but as a gap, there's a big gap on the enabling environment in terms of evidence, but also interestingly enough on exposure. Not that much looking at the impact of interventions on reducing exposure, for example. And in the intervention heat map, not so many projects looking at adoption of climate change adaptation or about looking at exposure again. So I think that's something of interest to kind of think about and maybe factor into at least studying. So I'm going to leave you with these observations so that you can maybe think through them, and also we'll see with the next presentations, which may also shed a little bit more light on this, and we can hopefully have some discussion around it. Thank you. Next slide.
Thank you, Nathalie. Thank you, Nathalie. Thank you, Louis. This is indeed a rich study and with lots of different findings and lots of different things to talk about. So great that you were able to put that into a couple of slides and bring this here to the discussion. Before I move on to this discussants, I just wanted to use that opportunity to maybe pause for a second, just to say thank you very much for the array of different questions that we've already received. We're happy to talk about this in a minute. This seems very relevant, and there's a lot of interest. As you know, it's already been published. That's been something that you can find on our respective websites. I'll just wanted to quickly touch base on two items that have been raised. For instance, also through Jerry, to ask of an IEU review using at country classifications as it is here based on income. I just wanted to make you aware and alert you to this. This presentation today is on the evidence gap map and intervention heat map. It's a joint collaborative work that we've done together with the people present as well as other co-authors. This is not an IEU review on the GCF. Evidence reviews for us are building that cornerstone and building that foundation to look at the global evidence. And here I really need to stress this. This is a study that we have done on the global evidence in the adaptation space by looking at the literature, and that's including sources like the Web of Science, as well as Scopus, as well as Gray literature, on studies that are looking at impacts, to then be able to look at what we know in terms of these pairings that Nathalie presented. So it's very important to make that difference. This is not an evaluation on the portfolio of the GCF. It's rather allowing us to look into the global space of adaptation and better understanding of where we stand at the moment in terms of global evidence. And that to say as well, this is for that reason, it's not totally aligned to what UNFCCC would look at. We really want to go beyond the climate space here and look at how we can learn as an organization, as an IEU, as well as the evaluation space. That's why it's done together with the German Evaluation Development Institute, and also then from that learning, use that learning and present that learning and use that learning in the lessons learned from that in subsequent work. So that's very important to raise that here. Thank you very much for the other questions. They're very much on the point, and I'll get to this in a second after the discussants. So I'll invite now Martin to give us a brief 5 minutes presentation on what he'd like to discuss in view of this work, and then we move on from there to the other two discussants. Over to Martin.
Thank you, Andreas. And the evidence gap map on adaptation shows a concentration of data on studies on agriculture, especially in terms of adoption and also economic benefits, and on agriculture in Africa, and also a dearth of evidence on the water sector, for example, and also a dearth of evidence on studies from Latin America. I wanted to use this opportunity just to place the study in context and to highlight the global climate adaptation space and what we know about that, so we can locate the evidence gap map within that, and especially the intervention heat map within that, before handing over to colleagues from DEval. So what do we know about the global adaptation finance space? Well, global adaptation finance needs in 2030 are estimated around 220 billion per year, and currently external resources that are flowing to developing countries are around between 27 and 30 billion from 2018. And we can see from this graphic that there was a considerable increase in finance flows in 2017, and this was largely due to an increase in funding from multilateral development banks. Next slide, please. Bilateral flows to adaptation, bilateral donors' share of external resources to adaptation are increasing in absolute terms, but they're staying stable in terms of a share of total external adaptation flows. So we can see that whilst the amount of finance from bilaterals to adaptation is increasing, the share of the total adaptation finance is staying flat. In contrast, we see that multilateral development banks' contribution to adaptation finance is increasing sharply, and is focusing especially on infrastructure and on productive sectors. And this will continue to increase as the World Bank increases its finance to adaptation in the coming years. Next slide, please. When we look at the different flows to the adaptation, we find that bilaterals mainly offer grants, about 70% grants and about 30% loans. Multilateral development banks focus almost entirely all of their flows on loans. Climate funds, such as the GCF, offer both grants and loan on quite equal proportions. And all of the three actors within adaptation finance flows to developing countries, external finance flows to developing countries, focus on vulnerable countries. Next slide, please. When we look at climate funds in particular, and GCF is the largest climate fund, and in fact has resources that are greater than all the other adaptation climate funds put together, we find a balanced portfolio between adaptation and mitigation. Next slide, please. And when we compare the regional focus or foci of bilaterals, multilateral development banks, and climate funds, we see quite a similar focus between bilaterals and multilateral development banks, although bilateral agreements have a large share of unspecified flows. And we find with climate funds, which are clearly the smallest player within this space, a slightly greater focus on Africa, and a smaller focus, for example, on Asia and the Americas. Next slide, please. When we look at all of those actors, in what sectors they're contributing their finance to, what we see quite clearly is an increase in finance to productive sectors, to infrastructure, to water. And this is mainly due to the increase in multilateral development bank funding from 2017. Next slide, please. When we look at the Green Climate Fund in particular, our result areas provide a high-level understanding of where our finance is going, and we see that most of this finance is flowing to vulnerable, the vulnerable and livelihoods result area, and limited amount of finance, the least amount of finance, is flowing to ecosystems and ecosystem services. We can get much greater granularity and precision in terms of the focus of GCF projects, and the portfolio is 107 projects, including both pure adaptation projects and cross-cutting projects, when we look at the specific impact areas from funding proposals. And here we see a focus on water, access, management and use. We see a focus on climate information systems, and also we see a focus on improving crops and food security. And this is where we find a very useful link to the evidence gap map on climate adaptation, because what we see from the evidence gap map is that we have high quality evidence on agriculture, and especially agriculture in Africa, and that can be used and that can be used and could well be utilized by stakeholders and by the GCF. But we also find that the impact area that most funding proposals, most adaptation funding proposals are focusing on is water access, management and use. And there we have a complete dearth of high quality evidence on impacts in adaptation. We see resources flowing to that area in a similar way to other intervention types, but we have a lack of high quality evidence in that area, and that's something that could be picked up. And with that, I'll thank Nathalie and Luis for an excellent presentation, and I'll hand back to Andreas before moving on to our colleagues from DEval.
Thanks very much, Martin, for this stock take on where we stand with the adaptation space. Really interesting indeed. I move it over very quickly to Alexandra right away. Here you go, Alexandra.
Yeah, thank you. And let me share briefly some experiences DEval made using the evidence gap map in our evaluations on climate change adaptation. So on this slide, just as a background, you see some information on the current comprehensive evaluation we are doing on climate change adaptation, which runs over several years. And as part of this, you can see an allocation and portfolio analysis, which is already available online, a synthesis study on Germany's contribution to the Forest and Climate Protection Program, RED+, as well as our joint publications with the GCF. Amongst other work, we are currently using the EGM for the evaluation synthesis and systematic review, which is part of the evaluation of interventions on climate change adaptation of German development cooperation. On the next slide, let me share briefly some opportunities we see applying EGMs in our evaluations. First of all, it clearly helps to identify evidence clusters and gaps and to orient further work in targeted evaluations. Also, a rigorous impact assessment could be easily fed into the existing evidence gap map. Secondly, beyond identifying the need for impact studies, it can also be helpful to identify opportunities for meta-analysis, such as systematic reviews, and it can connect scientific evidence map with evaluations and evaluation synthesis, as we currently do for the German Development Cooperation. This conceptual framework itself, with the definition of outcomes, etc., has been very useful for us and can be adapted for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. On the next slide, let me share some limitations we faced while using the EGM in our current work. First of all, the broad range of classification for interventions and outcomes may obscure some details, and it turns out that for some, for example, the sector defined as society, economy and health in the EGM is one single sector, but could perhaps be split into three. In our current evaluation synthesis, the EGM framework is a little bit too highly aggregated. So what we do is to stick to the approach, but to define sub-outcomes and sub-categories based on our needs. However, we figured out that the team must be very clear about common understanding, especially if it's a big team working on that, and we required some time resources to work on clear definitions and common understanding of categories. As already discussed, as an opportunity to guide further work, the direction of magnitude of an impact is unclear. So an EGM does not show if interventions were successful or not, and to what extent. The EGM only considers evidence obtained through quantitative data or in experimental settings. So there is at least one quantitative aspect or regression to be included in the EGM, and qualitative evidence is excluded, which is a limitation for evaluating the German development cooperation. However, for some interventions, such as governance mechanism for strengthening resilience or awareness raising, there might be a lot of evidence with qualitative approaches. So an option we're thinking about could be to work on criteria, what is good qualitative evidence, and to include it as well in the further steps. So further step would also be that regular updates are required, perhaps at least every second year, using the same systematic protocol. This is also a question of resources. And then we also face the language bias, which was already addressed by Nathalie and Luis. So there is a underrepresentation of studies and non-English search terms, for example, in Latin America, as Luis already pointed out, which might be misleading. An option to limit the language bias could be to do a quick research using translated keywords such as effectiveness or climate change adaptation to get a quick overview, really a very rushed, quick first overview on potential clusters of evidence in, for example, German or in French or Arabic. This would also be helpful to prioritize this language for inclusion. We selected some keywords and did a quick research on evidence clusters in German speaking journals, but did find nearly no evidence, so German would not be a priority language to include in further updates. So there might also be a very uneven, the language bias might be very uneven dependent on the language. As a quick conclusion, the EGM provides multiple opportunities for evaluation as it compares academic, for example, for comparing academic evidence and evaluation evidence. It sets the focus for new evidence generation and evaluations and gives the opportunity for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexandra. Now over to Kevin, and he has that very hard deal of trying to wrap up really quickly because we really want to ensure that we have at least 10 to 15 minutes of a discussion. So Kevin, two to 3 minutes if you can.
I'll be as quick as possible. Thank you very much, Andreas. So the idea is to quickly talk about the relevance and the implications that the intervention heat map could have. And first, the intervention heat map helps decision makers to understand where interventions are operating in evidence-rich or evidence-scarce fields. And so this is important to find out where interventions are backed by evidence already, that the generation of new evidence could be focused elsewhere, or where interventions or funds are not backed by evidence. This could indicate a priority for generating new evidence. And this is very important in order for decision makers to understand to which extent resources and the evidence base are correlated, right? And the great thing is that the intervention heat map follows the same conceptual framework as the evidence gap map. So the comparison between the evidence and the portfolio can be made for any sector, intervention and outcome combination. So it's very versatile. And lastly, the intervention heat maps help prioritize the generation of new evidence or perhaps the synthesis of existing evidence in terms of effect size aggregation. And this is a step further than the evidence gap map, right? So while the evidence gap map finds evidence gaps, the intervention heat map helps identify specific interventions that could be already funded or implemented that are not yet backed by evidence. And as a caveat, it's still really important to critically appraise the evidence in identified evidence gap maps. And this is something that you already mentioned. Perhaps it could be as a result of our inclusion criteria that certain important evidences, including qualitative evidence, were excluded, even though there's a strong amount of interventions or funding going to that. Could you go to the next slide, please, Andreas? Thank you. So using intervention heat maps and combining them with evidence gap maps has several implications. So where interventions are allocated, but the evidence is lacking, like I mentioned, there could be a focus to generate new evidence. Where interventions are allocated and there already is evidence, it may be useful to aggregate effect sizes, like Alexandra, my colleague, already mentioned, using systematic reviews or meta-analyses. One important implication is that evidence gaps don't imply that an intervention isn't relevant or effective. And I've been quickly going through some of the questions in the comments. This is particularly true in German cooperation, where we have innovative or pilot projects, for example, regarding climate risk insurance. It is still very important to pilot approaches, even where there is no evidence available. Another implication is that more evidence doesn't imply better evidence. Like I mentioned, we have to look at the excluded study designs more carefully and see whether qualitative evidence could be important to include potentially in further evidence gap maps. A key limitation of the intervention heat map is this time dimension that was not considered. So while the methodology is clear about for which years the evidence and portfolio data is included, it is impossible to determine based on what evidence which project or fund was made. And this is very important. And this could be something for further tweaking the intervention heat map in later on. However, we found that the intervention heat map really can promote the communication between decision makers, in our case, the German federal ministries and the implementing organizations, and us as a research institution. So it really sparked the conversation there. And then the key takeaway, really briefly, intervention heat maps help focus where to improve existing evidence or generate new evidence, and really ultimately help accountability, effectiveness, and communication of development cooperation. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. That was almost 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. Very nice. I'll go right over to some questions because, Kevin, I'll put you on the spot here. From Marco, we got a question. If the money goes where the evidence is, will that no direct funding to easy projects or away from complex ones? And he also raised that issue of the question of quantitative studies, what happens with qualitative studies. That's also been a concern with Monica. Kevin, if I ask you to respond to this quickly, that would be great.
Yeah, really quickly. So intervention heat maps should not be used to direct funding the way they are currently. And that is because the coding of the projects hasn't been very accurate in terms of the German cooperation. The coding was done using OECD, the Common Reporting Standard System, which is very difficult because you basically use project titles to try to code projects that are quite complicated. And again, I mentioned briefly a minute ago, this missing time dimension. So really the intervention heat map would need to be tweaked quite strongly because right now they're really only about correlations where funding goes to where evidence is. Rather, it's just a correlation between the funding and the projects. There would have to be an incorporation there to include this time dimension. And like I mentioned, this lack of evidence doesn't mean that the interventions are not relevant or effective. And I think that was Monica's question, Andreas. We need to include potentially in further revisions of the evidence gap map to be more comprehensive in the inclusion criteria, particularly related to qualitative evidence. That could be a possibility.
Great, thanks, Kevin. That sounds very, very invigorating, very interesting indeed. I'll have another question here from Joanna. I think it's important to look deeper into society, economy, and health categories. And I know Nathalie had spoken about this. And Nathalie, if you wanted to elaborate real quick on this a little bit, it seems to be a very interesting question and what to do with health. And then Robert was also asking how water was looked at and if it would only work, apologies, if it would only focus on WASH or also integrate the integrated water resource management, the IWRM, which would correspond to the SDGs. Over to you, Nathalie.
Okay, yeah. So the last category as the society, economy, and health, as I mentioned, it really was a bit of a catch-all, and I agree that we probably would have been a good idea to disaggregate that a bit better. But at the same time, in terms of the number of studies that we found in all of that category, there wasn't that many. So I guess we would have had a lot more empty spaces if we had, let's say, one for society, one for health, and one for economy. So I'm not sure if that actually answered that particular question. In terms of the water, now, if you look at all of the types of interventions that we looked at, so we had nature-based options, we had technological options, etc., etc. So yes, water resource management would have been a nature-based option in the water sector. So that those types of studies, if they were found, were categorized there.
Thanks, Nathalie. Really, really great. Really great to also highlight that a little bit. I was part of the team, as you know, and that's been really a curveball at times. I wanted to move over to a question that was asked by Ferko because it was very interesting indeed. This question on and how did we look at whether the evidence was positive or was it worth spending the money? And in that regard, we're also maybe highlighting a little bit this question of what to do next. Martin, if you wanted to come in on this and explain a little bit of what people, what one can do once an evidence gap map is done.
Yeah, thank you, Andreas. And also just following on Kevin's point around meta-analysis. So when we find a cell within the intervention outcome framework has a critical mass of studies, so typically this would be more than 10 experimental, but ideally more than that, because a number of the studies would not be on the precisely the same intervention or the precise outcome variables, let's say sort of 15 or more. Once you have that critical mass of studies, of experimental studies in a cell, you can aggregate those studies and look at the effect sizes from the interventions. And when doing so, you increase the sample size of those studies, and by doing that, you reduce the confidence intervals around your impact estimates, and that can lead you to and you can also include moderator variables in that particular model. And in doing so, you can get a clearer idea of how much bang you get for your buck, if you like, for particular types of interventions, which are like almost the precisely the same intervention looking at precisely the same outcome variable. So it's quite hard to find those cells, but when you do, that can help you get an idea about the impact of interventions, and that can help guide funding decisions, but only when you've got that critical mass of studies. And in this particular study, we did not find cells that had that critical mass of experimental studies. So Luis and other co-authors, including Andreas and myself, looked at one cell that did have a number of studies, but not experimental studies, but sort of correlational studies, mainly looking at sort of logit or probit models, looking at access to credit. And we looked at a number, 40 or plus different studies there, and we assessed those in terms of the whether those studies showed whether access to credit showed a correlation with the adoption of adaptation interventions or not. And the findings were mixed. And that particular meta-analysis is also co-written and in collaboration with DEval, and that will be published on the same DEval website next week, I believe. Andreas, back to you.
Thanks, Martin. Yes, indeed, quite interesting. Luis, I have no questions right now for you because we're almost at the hour. I really wish to ask one last question, if you allow. That is more a question that we've heard from Yonji, also one of the participants here. A quick question to Kevin and Alexandra to ask: has DEval actually shown the evidence gap met intervention heat map to policymakers, and what was the reaction?
Yeah, really quickly.
Yeah,
I can answer to that. Yeah. So yes, we've shown the intervention heat map and evidence gap maps with the federal ministries, the German federal ministries, so the BMZ mostly, also the GIZ and KfW in terms of our different reference group discussions that we've had with them. The reaction, really briefly, it's very useful for them, but rather than for portfolio development, really it's more about focusing more evidence. So where evidence either has to be generated, or where it's useful to do, like what Martin just mentioned, more meta-analyses on aggregating effect sizes. So in terms of portfolio development, they were very reserved, just because of the caveats that we've mentioned regarding the intervention heat maps.
Great, Kevin. That's great to know that this is indeed also helping to some extent to talk to decision makers and then see how the evidence can be used. Dear colleagues, participants, we've come to the hour, we've come to the end. I'm very sorry. I would have loved to have taken more time on the Q&A. Apologies for this. We have all your questions. If you want to leave your email addresses, we'll get back to you. And even in bilateral conversations, we're happy to chat about this. Please also visit our website to see the evidence gap map, as well as the website of FreeIE, where we have published them as well. Here, I'd like to highlight some of the items from the IEU as well. So we have recently published a blog from one of our esteemed colleagues of Dr. Bernhard Seliger from the Hans Seidel Foundation here in Korea on the question on greening North Korea, what opportunities for the GCF. So please visit our website to see that blog. It's a very invigorating and interesting read. Next slide, please. And we've also would like to acknowledge that we've continued with our Evaluator, DEvaluator podcast. So we are now on the 6th episode already, talking about measuring change with randomized control trials, the story of the G-Saver. And that's an interview we've done with Dr. Kwon Shin from Hanyang University here in Korea as well. So if you like to hear more about this, please tune in and subscribe to our podcast. And next slide, I'd like to thank you all for this very nice discussion and very interesting presentations that we've heard. Thanks, and please stay tuned. Our next IEU Virtual Talk will be on January 28th, and it will feature one of our partner university here, SNU here in Korea, and we will hear more about green and smart cities. So thank you very much for this, and I wish you all a very good afternoon, good morning, and good night for those that are on that end of the world. Thank you very much.